Some people grieve, others plot. I chose both, because when I found her in my home, hands on my son's toys, mouth full of rules she made up, I realized she'd mistaken tragedy for permission. She thought the loss of a child meant the loss of my will to fight. She was wrong. What she didn't know was that this house, and every inch of her lie, was already part of a bigger investigation, one she had just added herself to. Let me know in the comments if you, like me, have suffered pain during the most difficult times of your life. My name is David Thompson, and at 45 years old, I thought I had seen every type of corruption and abuse of power during my 2 decades with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. After my wife Sarah passed from cancer 2 years ago, I took early retirement to focus on raising Michael, my energetic 8-year-old son, who loved building Lego castles and asking endless questions about everything. 3 months ago, a drunk driver ran a red light and took Michael from me, leaving me alone in our 2-story home in Meadowbrook Estates, a suburban community governed by one of the most controlling homeowners associations I'd ever encountered. Linda Morrison had ruled our 47-home neighborhood with an iron fist for 5 years running. At 52, this wealthy housewife treated the HOA like her personal kingdom, using vaguely worded regulations to intimidate residents into submission. Her husband Robert worked as a corporate lawyer, spending most of his time traveling, which left Linda free to micromanage every aspect of our community. Her 16-year-old son Derek was already showing signs of inheriting his mother's entitled attitude, running a landscaping business that somehow always seemed to win HOA contracts despite his obvious inexperience. The first sign of trouble came just 2 weeks after Michael's funeral, when Linda approached me during one of her daily inspections of the neighborhood. She stood on my front walkway, clipboard in hand, wearing her usual expression of barely contained disgust. "David, I understand you're grieving, but personal tragedy doesn't excuse neglecting community standards," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your lawn is nearly 3 inches tall, which violates our maintenance requirements. I'm issuing a $50 fine. When I measured the grass myself later that day, it was exactly 2.8 inches, well within the 3-inch limit clearly stated in our HOA covenant." This was my first hint that Linda Morrison wasn't just strict about rules, she was actively making them up as she went along. The harassment escalated systematically over the following weeks, each incident carefully calculated to push me towards some kind of breaking point. Linda's second violation notice arrived just 3 days later, this time citing me for failure to maintain appropriate seasonal decorations with a $100 fine. Halloween had just passed, and while other houses in the neighborhood remained undecorated, Linda had specifically targeted me for not participating in what she called community spirit building activities. When I explained that I wasn't in the mood for Halloween decorations so soon after losing my son, her response was chilling. "Mr. Thompson, personal grief cannot be allowed to diminish property values in this community. Our home prices depend on maintaining consistent standards across all residences." By the 3rd week, Linda had convinced several neighbors that I posed some kind of threat to community safety. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow who had always been kind to Michael, began crossing the street to avoid me during my evening walks. Tom Rodriguez, who worked construction and lived 2 houses down, later told me that Linda had been spreading rumors about my unstable mental state and potential for violence. She held impromptu coffee meetings with small groups of residents, sharing her concerns about having a disturbed individual living among families with children. The psychological warfare was textbook manipulation, designed to isolate me from any potential allies before moving to the next phase of her campaign. The financial harassment intensified as Linda began issuing citations for increasingly ridiculous violations. A $75 fine for having my garage door open for more than 4 hours during the day, despite no such restriction existing in our covenants. Another $100 penalty for parking my car incorrectly in my own driveway because it wasn't centered precisely between the painted lines. When I requested copies of the specific regulations I was supposedly violating, Linda's assistant claimed they were internal HOA documents not available for resident review. My FBI training had taught me to document everything, so I began photographing every citation, recording dates and times, and maintaining detailed logs of each interaction. During the 4th week, Linda escalated to direct intimidation tactics. She installed a security camera on her property, positioned specifically to monitor my front yard and driveway. When I objected during the next HOA meeting, she claimed it was community safety equipment installed on common property for everyone's protection. Her justification was that recent behavioral concerns from certain residents had made enhanced surveillance necessary. The other homeowners sat in uncomfortable silence as Linda essentially accused me of being dangerous without using my name directly. Tom Rodriguez was the only person who spoke up, pointing out that the camera seemed to focus exclusively on my house, but Linda dismissed his concerns as misunderstanding the broader security strategy. The psychological pressure reached its peak when Linda organized a special HOA meeting, ostensibly to discuss community safety protocols, but clearly designed to publicly humiliate me. She had prepared a presentation about identifying and managing residents who display concerning behavioral patterns that described my situation in thinly veiled terms. According to Linda's presentation, isolated individuals who avoided community activities and showed signs of depression represented potential risks to neighborhood security. She suggested implementing a wellness check system where neighbors would report suspicious behavior to the HOA board for investigation. Mrs. Patterson later told me she had been uncomfortable with the entire meeting, but felt pressured to go along with Linda's recommendations. The final straw came when Linda sent me a formal letter threatening legal action if I didn't demonstrate improved community compliance and mental stability within 30 days. The letter, written on official HOA letterhead, claimed I had been resistant to reasonable community standards and showed patterns of antisocial behavior that impact neighborhood harmony. She demanded that I attend mandatory counseling sessions with a therapist of her choosing and participate in at least 3 community activities per month as proof of my rehabilitation. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat about exploring all available options to protect our community's well-being and property values if I failed to comply. While Linda Morrison thought she was dealing with a grief-stricken widower who would eventually break under pressure, she had no idea that 20 years of FBI training had taught me exactly how to investigate corruption and build bulletproof cases against people who abuse their authority. I began by thoroughly examining our HOA's financial records, which, as a homeowner, I had every legal right to review. What I discovered was a pattern of financial irregularities that would have made my former colleagues at the Bureau salivate with anticipation. Over the previous 2 years, Linda had authorized payments totaling $47,000 to Morrison Landscaping, a company owned and operated by her teenage son, Derek. The invoices claimed services like community park maintenance and common area landscape design, but our neighborhood had no community park and only 3 small common areas with basic grass and a few trees. When I cross-referenced these payments with actual work performed, I found that Derek had been paid $1,500 per month for lawn maintenance that consisted of mowing the same 3 tiny grass strips that any homeowner could have maintained in an hour. The most egregious charge was $8,000 for irrigation system installation in an area where no irrigation system existed. My investigation into Linda's rule enforcement revealed an even more disturbing pattern of selective persecution. I obtained copies of every violation notice issued over the past 3 years and discovered that Linda had been systematically targeting homeowners who opposed her leadership or questioned her decisions. Families who attended HOA meetings and asked inconvenient questions suddenly found themselves receiving multiple citations for minor infractions that other residents routinely ignored without consequence. The Rodriguez family had been fined over $1,000 in the 6 months after Tom questioned Linda's decision to hire her son's company, while the Hendersons, who always supported Linda's proposals, had never received a single violation notice, despite having the most overgrown yard in the neighborhood. The deeper I dug into Linda's activities, the more evidence I found of systematic abuse of her position. She had been using the HOA's master key system to enter homes when residents were away, claiming she was conducting safety inspections that weren't authorized by her covenants or required by any local ordinance. Several neighbors later admitted they had noticed things moved or disturbed in their homes after extended absences, but had been too intimidated to complain directly to Linda. She had also been intercepting mail delivery to community members who opposed her, claiming packages were improperly addressed and needed to be held at the HOA office for verification. The most damning evidence came when I discovered that Linda had been forging resident signatures on official HOA documents. The petition she had created demanding my removal from the community contained signatures from 3 families who later confirmed they had never seen the document, let alone signed it. Linda had apparently traced their signatures from other HOA paperwork and transferred them to her petition, creating false evidence of community support for her harassment campaign. This wasn't just abuse of power anymore, it was criminal fraud that could result in serious legal consequences. My breakthrough came when I decided to thoroughly research the property records for our entire neighborhood, something my FBI background had taught me to do when investigating any organization's claims about assets and authority. What I discovered in the county recorder's office changed everything I thought I knew about Meadowbrook Estates and Linda Morrison's supposed authority over community property. The original land development had been purchased in 1967 by Henry Thompson, my grandfather, who had bought the entire 40-acre tract with plans to develop a family compound. Instead, he had sold individual lots to create the neighborhood, while retaining ownership of 3 key parcels that everyone assumed belonged to the HOA. Armed with evidence of Linda's financial fraud, abuse of authority, and forged documents, I was prepared to expose her corruption through proper legal channels when she made the critical error that would destroy her completely. I had been away for 2 days attending a law enforcement conference in the state capital, something I had mentioned casually during our last HOA meeting. When I returned home Thursday evening, I found Linda Morrison in Michael's bedroom, directing 2 men I didn't recognize as they packed my son's belongings into cardboard boxes. "What exactly do you think you're doing in my house?" I asked, my voice calm despite the rage building inside me. Linda didn't even look embarrassed at being caught in what was clearly criminal trespassing. Instead, she gestured around Michael's room as if she owned it. "This space is being converted into community storage, David. A single man doesn't need a 4-bedroom house, and the HOA has determined this room can better serve the entire neighborhood." The 2 men continued packing Michael's toys and clothes, while Linda explained her reasoning with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been challenged. When I stepped forward and firmly told the men to stop touching my son's belongings, Linda immediately pulled out her cell phone. "I'm calling 911 right now. You're threatening us and showing clear signs of violent behavior." She dialed the emergency number while staring directly at me, her expression a mixture of triumph and disgust. "Yes, I need police assistance immediately. There's a mentally unstable man threatening myself and 2 workers inside his own home. He's been showing increasingly erratic behavior, and I'm concerned for our safety." Linda had just made the biggest mistake of her life, because she had no idea that the mentally unstable man she was reporting had spent 2 decades building cases against people exactly like her. When officers Martinez and Stevens arrived 15 minutes later, Linda immediately launched into her prepared narrative about my dangerous mental state and history of threatening behavior toward HOA officials. She presented them with copies of the violation notices she had issued, claiming they demonstrated a pattern of escalating resistance to community authority. "This man has been unstable since his child died, and today he completely lost control when we tried to implement a community improvement project." Linda had clearly rehearsed this speech, confident that her word as HOA president would carry more weight than mine. Officer Stevens looked familiar, and when he saw my face, his expression changed immediately. "Agent Thompson? Mike Stevens. We worked together on the Williams embezzlement case 3 years ago." I shook his hand, grateful for the recognition that instantly shifted the entire dynamic of the situation. When I explained what had actually happened, producing my property deed and the master key that Linda had used to enter my home without permission, both officers immediately understood they had been called to the scene of a crime in progress. Linda's face went pale as she realized her carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in real time. The evidence of Linda's criminal activity was overwhelming and undeniable. I showed the officers my security camera footage of Linda entering my home with the unauthorized key, directing the removal of my personal property, and making false statements to emergency services. When they asked about the community storage claim, I produced the original HOA covenants, which contained no provisions for converting private bedrooms into common areas. Linda tried to argue that the HOA board had voted on the conversion, but couldn't produce any meeting minutes or documentation because no such vote had ever taken place. Officer Martinez informed Linda that she was being investigated for criminal trespassing, theft, and filing a false police report. With Linda's criminal behavior now documented by law enforcement, I decided it was time to expose the full extent of her corruption to our entire community. Using the HOA's own bylaws, I petitioned for an emergency meeting by collecting signatures from 25% of the homeowners, something that was surprisingly easy once people learned about Linda's unauthorized entry into my home. Tom Rodriguez was the first to sign, followed quickly by Mrs. Patterson, who had been feeling guilty about avoiding me after Linda's rumor campaign. Within 48 hours, I had signatures from 15 families, well above the 12 needed to force the emergency meeting. Linda couldn't refuse the meeting without violating the HOA's governing documents, but she clearly expected to maintain control of the narrative through her usual intimidation tactics. She scheduled the meeting for Saturday evening at 7 o'clock in the community center, sending out notices that described the gathering as addressing recent disruptions to community harmony caused by a problematic resident. Linda had no idea that I had spent the previous week preparing a comprehensive presentation that would systematically dismantle her entire operation in front of the people she had been manipulating for 5 years. 43 of our 47 families attended the meeting, the largest turnout in HOA history. Linda opened with her standard authority speech, emphasizing her years of dedicated service and the difficult decisions required to maintain community standards. We're here tonight because certain individuals refuse to accept the responsibilities that come with living in a managed community, she began, clearly referring to me without using my name. Some people think grief gives them permission to ignore rules that everyone else follows without complaint. Linda was confident that her usual tactics would work, but she had seriously underestimated both my preparation and the community's readiness to hear the truth. I had prepared a detailed presentation using the same investigative techniques that had made me successful at the FBI, organizing evidence chronologically and building toward the most damning revelations. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm David Thompson, and I want to start by apologizing for not being more involved in our community activities since my son Michael passed away. But I'm not here to talk about my grief tonight. I'm here to present evidence of systematic financial fraud, abuse of authority, and criminal behavior by our HOA president. The room fell completely silent as I connected my laptop to the projector and began displaying Linda's forged documents and falsified financial records. The financial evidence was devastating and impossible to deny. I showed bank records proving that Linda had authorized payments of $47,000 to her son's landscaping company over 2 years, money that had supposedly paid for services that were never performed. The invoices claimed maintenance work on a community park that didn't exist, and irrigation installation in areas where no irrigation had ever been installed. Linda Morrison has been stealing your money to pay her teenage son for imaginary work while raising your HOA fees to cover the budget shortfalls, I explained, letting the implications sink in before moving to the next phase of evidence. The documentation of selective enforcement was equally damning, showing how Linda had weaponized HOA regulations to punish anyone who questioned her authority. I displayed charts showing violation patterns that clearly demonstrated her targeting of specific families while ignoring identical infractions by her supporters. The Rodriguez family received over $1,000 in fines after Tom questioned Linda's hiring practices, while the Hendersons, who never opposed Linda's proposals, had never received a single citation despite obvious violations. The murmur of angry voices began growing louder as people realized they had been systematically manipulated and extorted. When I presented the evidence of Linda's unauthorized home entries and the forged petition demanding my removal, the community's anger reached a boiling point. Several residents confirmed they had noticed signs of entry into their homes during extended absences, and 3 families publicly denied signing the petition that bore their supposedly authentic signatures. Linda tried to interrupt multiple times, claiming I was presenting misleading information, taken out of context, but the evidence was too comprehensive and well documented for any reasonable person to dismiss. The final revelation about property ownership sent shockwaves through the entire room. I displayed the original property records showing that my grandfather had retained ownership of the 3 parcels Linda claimed as HOA property, including the area where she had installed surveillance cameras to monitor my activities. Linda Morrison has been exercising authority over land that doesn't belong to the HOA and never has. Her entire power structure is built on a foundation of lies and forged documents. Robert Morrison, Linda's husband, stood up from the back of the room with an expression of complete shock and announced that as an attorney he recognized criminal behavior when he saw it, and his wife would need to hire her own legal representation. The community's response was swift and unanimous. Linda Morrison was immediately removed from her position as HOA president by a vote of 42-0, with only Linda herself abstaining. Tom Rodriguez was elected as interim president, with a mandate to implement emergency reforms and work with law enforcement to recover the stolen funds. Linda stormed out of the meeting while residents lined up to apologize to me and share their own stories of harassment and intimidation they had been too afraid to report while she held power. The legal consequences for Linda's actions were severe and comprehensive. The district attorney filed charges for embezzlement, criminal trespassing, filing false police reports, and multiple counts of document fraud. Derek Morrison was required to return every penny of his fraudulent landscaping payments, totaling $47,000 plus interest and penalties. Linda's surveillance equipment was removed from community property, and she was banned from serving in any HOA capacity for the rest of her time in the neighborhood. Robert Morrison filed for divorce within 2 weeks, citing irreconcilable differences and his inability to be married to someone who had committed crimes against their own neighbors. The transformation of Meadowbrook Estates began immediately, under Tom Rodriguez's leadership. The new HOA board, which included Mrs. Patterson and 2 other longtime residents who had been intimidated into silence during Linda's reign, implemented strict financial oversight procedures and transparent governance policies. All community expenditures over $50 now required board approval with detailed documentation, and monthly financial reports became available to every homeowner. The days of secretive decisions and unexplained expenses were permanently over. Within 6 months, our neighborhood had become a model of effective community governance. Property values increased as word spread about our transparent management and resident-friendly policies. The new HOA board established clear, fair enforcement procedures that applied equally to everyone, ending the era of selective persecution and arbitrary penalties. Tom Rodriguez often said that Linda's abuse of power had inadvertently taught our community the importance of checks and balances in any organization with authority over people's homes and lives. 1 year after Linda Morrison's downfall, Meadowbrook Estates had become the kind of community that Michael would have loved to grow up in. The residents had voted to convert one of my grandfather's retained parcels into the Michael Thompson Memorial Park, a beautiful space with playground equipment, walking trails, and garden areas where families could gather for community events. The park's dedication ceremony drew visitors from surrounding neighborhoods who wanted to learn about our transformation from a divided community into a model of cooperative living. I had been asked to serve as HOA president multiple times, but declined in favor of working as an unpaid consultant to help other communities facing similar corruption problems. My FBI background proved invaluable in identifying and documenting abuse of authority in homeowners associations across the region, and I found deep satisfaction in helping ordinary people stand up to petty tyrants who thought their positions made them untouchable. The skills I had developed investigating financial crimes translated perfectly to exposing HOA corruption, and word of my success spread quickly through community networks. The final chapter of Linda Morrison's story came 18 months after her removal from power. Unable to find employment in our area after her criminal conviction, and facing bankruptcy from legal fees and restitution payments, Linda and Derek moved to another state where they hoped to start over without the burden of their local reputation. Before leaving, Robert Morrison stopped by my house to personally apologize for his ex-wife's behavior and to thank me for exposing the truth before her corruption could cause even more damage to our community. Linda Morrison had told me that personal grief was no excuse for disrupting her community standards, but she had been completely wrong about grief and completely wrong about what constituted a real community. The grief of losing Michael had indeed changed me, but it had given me the strength to fight for justice rather than the weakness Linda had expected to exploit. A true community isn't built on fear and intimidation like Linda's dictatorship. It's built on mutual respect, transparency, and the understanding that everyone deserves to be treated fairly regardless of their personal circumstances. Standing in Michael Thompson Memorial Park on a beautiful autumn evening, watching children play on equipment that my son never got to enjoy, I realized that fighting Linda Morrison had taught me something crucial about justice and community. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought in federal courtrooms against major criminals, but in community centers against petty tyrants who abuse their small amount of power to make other people's lives miserable. Michael's legacy lived on not just in the park that bore his name, but in the principle that no one should have to face injustice alone, and that communities are strongest when they protect their most vulnerable members rather than allowing bullies to prey on them.